I swear I wasn't trying to be cruel when I told Ryan I needed a break to sleep with my ex. I know how that sounds, but hear me out. I've always believed that honesty is the foundation of any real relationship, and I refuse to live my life pretending feelings don't exist just to make other people comfortable. Most people would have just cheated and lied about it, but I respected Ryan enough to tell him the truth about what I was going through. That Wednesday morning started like any other day in our shared apartment. Ryan was making his usual elaborate breakfast while I sat at our kitchen table with my coffee, scrolling through social media. We'd been together for about 18 months, living together for the last 8. And honestly, things had been feeling a little too comfortable lately. Not bad, just predictable in a way that made me wonder if I was settling for something safe instead of pursuing something that could be truly extraordinary. The night before, I'd run into my ex-boyfriend Marcus at a coffee shop near my work. We'd only talked for maybe 10 minutes, but there was this energy between us that I couldn't ignore. The same electricity that had drawn us together 3 years ago, before everything fell apart because we were both too young and immature to handle something that intense. Seeing him again reminded me of how passionate and unpredictable our relationship had been, and it made me realize I might still have unresolved feelings. I'd spent the whole night lying in bed next to Ryan, thinking about that conversation with Marcus and wondering what it meant for my current relationship. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to explore those emotions honestly, rather than just pushing them down and pretending they didn't exist. That's not who I am. I believe in facing difficult truths head-on instead of living in denial. So when Ryan asked me what was on my mind that morning, I decided to be completely transparent with him. I told him about running into Marcus and how it had stirred up feelings I thought I'd moved past. I explained that I was worried I might still have lingering attachment to my ex, and I couldn't fully commit to our relationship until I knew for sure where I stood emotionally. Ryan stopped cutting his fruit and looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. He asked me what exactly I was saying, so I explained more clearly. I said I thought I needed to take a short break from our relationship so I could spend some time with Marcus and figure out once and for all whether those old feelings were real or just nostalgia. I made it clear that this wasn't about being unhappy with Ryan or wanting to hurt him. I said he was an amazing boyfriend and that our relationship was good in many ways. But I explained that I'd rather be honest about my confusion now than spend months or years wondering what might have been, potentially resenting him for keeping me from exploring something important. The idea of sleeping with Marcus wasn't just about physical attraction, though that was definitely part of it. It was about closure and clarity. I needed to know if the intense connection we'd shared was still there, or if it was just a memory I'd romanticized over time. I couldn't move forward with Ryan until I'd answered that question honestly. Ryan went completely silent after I finished explaining. He didn't get angry or start yelling, which I took as a good sign. I thought maybe he was processing what I'd said and trying to understand my perspective. I told him I appreciated how mature he was being about such a difficult conversation, and that his reaction proved how strong our foundation really was. He asked how long I thought this break would take, and I said probably just a few days, maybe a week at most. I explained that Marcus was currently staying in some kind of cramped college hostel situation, which wouldn't be ideal for the kind of honest, emotional exploration we needed to do. I suggested that maybe Marcus could stay at our apartment for a few days while Ryan stayed somewhere else, just to give us the space and privacy we needed. Looking back, I realize how insane that suggestion must have sounded to Ryan. But at the time, it seemed like the most practical solution. Our apartment was comfortable and private, and it would allow Marcus and me to really focus on figuring out our emotional situation without distractions or awkward logistics. Ryan finished making his breakfast without saying much else. He said he needed to think about everything I'd told him and that we could talk more when he got home from work. I was relieved that he wasn't being possessive or jealous about the whole thing. I thought his calm reaction showed real emotional maturity and confidence in our relationship. After Ryan left for work, I felt this huge sense of relief. I'd been honest about my feelings instead of sneaking around behind his back like most people would have done. I'd given him the respect of telling him the truth about my emotional state, rather than pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I spent the morning texting with Marcus, explaining the situation and inviting him to stay at the apartment for a few days. He was surprised by my honesty with Ryan, but excited about the opportunity to reconnect and explore what was still between us. We made plans for him to come over that afternoon, with enough clothes for several days. Marcus arrived at the apartment around 3 in the afternoon with a duffel bag and this nervous energy that reminded me of why I'd been attracted to him in the first place. He'd always been more spontaneous and unpredictable than Ryan, more willing to take emotional risks and pursue intense experiences. Seeing him in our living room felt like stepping back into a more exciting version of myself. I showed him around the apartment, explaining where everything was, and making sure he felt comfortable. It felt weird, but also right to have him in the space I shared with Ryan. Like I was finally being honest about all the different parts of my life instead of keeping them artificially separated. We spent the afternoon talking about what had happened between us 3 years ago and why our relationship had ended. Marcus admitted that he'd been too immature and selfish back then, too focused on his own needs to really consider what I needed from a partner. He said he'd grown a lot since then and learned how to be more present and emotionally available. I told him about my relationship with Ryan, trying to be fair and honest about both the good parts and the areas where I felt unfulfilled. Ryan was stable and reliable and kind, but our relationship lacked the passion and intensity that Marcus and I had shared. I'd started to wonder if I was settling for something safe because I was afraid of getting hurt again. Marcus understood exactly what I meant. He said he'd been in a few relationships since we broke up, but none of them had the same electric connection we'd had. He said seeing me again had made him realize he might have made a mistake letting me go, and he was grateful I was brave enough to explore whether we could make things work this time. By evening, the energy between us was undeniable. We were sitting on the couch talking, and suddenly he was kissing me the way he used to, with this intensity that made my whole body respond. It felt like coming home to a part of myself I'd forgotten existed. The passion and excitement I'd been missing with Ryan was right there, as powerful as ever. We spent the night together in the guest room, and it was everything I'd remembered and more. Marcus had definitely learned some things in the years we'd been apart, and the physical connection between us was even stronger than it had been when we were younger. I felt like I was finally being authentic about my desires, instead of settling for something comfortable, but ultimately unsatisfying. The next morning, I woke up feeling more certain than ever that I'd made the right choice by being honest about my feelings. Marcus and I had this natural chemistry that couldn't be faked or forced. We understood each other in ways that felt effortless and right. I started to think that maybe this break with Ryan would become permanent, that I'd found my way back to the person I was really meant to be with. Marcus made breakfast while I showered, and when I came out, he was wearing one of Ryan's hoodies that had been hanging on a chair. It looked good on him, and I took a picture because he looked so natural and comfortable in our apartment. I posted it on my social media with a caption about how good it felt to reconnect with old friends and explore new possibilities. We spent the second day walking around the neighborhood, holding hands, and talking about what our future might look like if we decided to get back together. Marcus said he was thinking about transferring to a college closer to my work so we could build something real this time. I was touched by how serious he was about making things work between us. That evening, we cooked dinner together and talked about all the things we'd learned about ourselves in the years we'd been apart. I felt like I was seeing Marcus clearly for the first time, without all the drama and insecurity that had clouded our original relationship. We were both older and more mature now, better equipped to handle the intensity of our connection. I was starting to think I should probably call Ryan and have a more serious conversation about where things stood. It was becoming clear to me that what Marcus and I had was special and worth pursuing, and I didn't want to string Ryan along if I was falling back in love with someone else. But before I could figure out how to have that conversation, Ryan came home early from work. I heard Ryan's key in the lock around 4 in the afternoon, hours earlier than he usually got home from work. Marcus and I were on the couch watching a movie, and Marcus was still wearing Ryan's hoodie from that morning. The look on Ryan's face when he walked in and saw us together was unlike anything I'd ever seen from him before. He didn't say a word at first, just stood in the doorway staring at Marcus in his clothes, sitting on our couch like he belonged there. I could see Ryan's brain processing the scene, understanding exactly what had been happening in his apartment while he was at work trying to give me the space I'd asked for. I jumped up to explain, to remind Ryan that we'd talked about this and he'd seemed okay with me exploring my feelings. But the look in his eyes stopped me cold. This wasn't the calm, mature man who'd listened to my request for a break 2 days ago. This was someone who'd been pushed past his breaking point. Marcus stood up too, trying to be respectful and introduce himself properly. He said he appreciated Ryan being understanding about the situation, that not every guy would be cool with his girlfriend needing to figure out her feelings. But Ryan cut him off mid-sentence. Ryan told Marcus to sit back down and make himself comfortable because he was going to need somewhere to stay for a while. Then he looked at me and said that since I'd decided I needed to be with someone else, I could figure out where to live with that person. He said he was done pretending this was a temporary situation or some kind of mature exploration of feelings. I tried to argue that this wasn't what we'd agreed on, that he'd said he understood why I needed this break. But Ryan said he'd never agreed to let my ex-boyfriend move into our apartment and take over our life together. He said I'd asked for space to figure out my feelings, not permission to replace him in his own home. That's when Ryan pulled out his phone and called our landlord. I watched in horror as he explained that he needed to terminate our lease immediately due to changed circumstances. He said he understood there might be penalties, but he was prepared to pay whatever it cost to get out of the rental agreement. Marcus and I both tried to interrupt, to explain that this was an overreaction to what was supposed to be a temporary situation, but Ryan ignored us completely. He was focused entirely on the phone call, discussing logistics with the landlord, like we weren't even in the room. After he hung up, Ryan explained that the lease was entirely in his name because my credit hadn't been good enough when we'd applied for the apartment. He said I'd been living there as his guest for the past 8 months, and now he was withdrawing that invitation. Since I wanted to be with Marcus instead, I could figure out where to live with Marcus. I was stunned by how quickly everything was escalating. I'd expected Ryan to be upset, maybe even angry, but I'd never imagined he would kick me out of our home. I tried to reason with him, to explain that I wasn't choosing Marcus over him, just trying to understand my own feelings before making any permanent decisions. But Ryan said my actions spoke louder than my words. He said I'd brought another man into our bed and our life, and that wasn't something he could forgive or forget. He told me I had until the end of the week to get my things out, because that's when the movers were coming to pack up everything he wanted to keep. Marcus tried to defuse the situation by offering to leave immediately and find somewhere else to stay. He said he didn't want to cause problems between Ryan and me, that maybe we could continue our conversation somewhere else. But Ryan said it was too late for that. The damage was already done. Ryan started packing his own suitcase, explaining that he was going to stay at his brother's place until the apartment was cleared out. He said he didn't want to spend another night under the same roof as people who had so little respect for him and the relationship he'd invested 18 months of his life in building. As he packed, Ryan kept making comments about how naive he'd been to think I was actually being honest about wanting a break. He said he should have realized that asking for permission to sleep with my ex was just a way of making myself feel better about cheating. He said most people would have just had the affair and lied about it, but I'd found a way to make betrayal sound like emotional maturity. Within 3 days, Ryan had organized movers to pack up everything he considered his. Since he'd furnished most of the apartment before I moved in, that meant almost everything, except my clothes and a few personal items. I watched strangers carry out our couch, Our dining table, our bed, all the things that had made the place feel like home. Marcus tried to be supportive during the chaos, but I could see he was overwhelmed by how quickly the situation had spiraled out of control. He'd expected to spend a few romantic days reconnecting with me, not to become homeless, because my boyfriend had a complete meltdown over our perfectly reasonable request for space. The landlord confirmed that our lease was being terminated with penalties that Ryan was willing to pay. I had exactly 1 week to find somewhere else to live, and my savings account wasn't prepared for unexpected moving costs and security deposits. I'd gotten comfortable relying on Ryan's financial stability, and suddenly I was facing the reality of supporting myself in a city with expensive rent. Marcus suggested we could stay at his hostel temporarily while we figured out a more permanent solution. But when we showed up with my bags, the hostel manager explained that guest policies only allowed visitors for 1 or 2 nights maximum. Marcus was already pushing the limits by staying there long-term as a student, and bringing a girlfriend to live there would violate his housing agreement. I started calling friends to ask if I could crash on their couches for a few nights. Most of them were sympathetic, but couldn't offer long-term solutions. Sarah said I could stay for a weekend, but her roommate had strict rules about overnight guests. Jessica offered her couch for 2 nights, but she was going out of town the following week and couldn't leave me alone in her apartment. The whole situation was becoming more humiliating by the day. I'd gone from having a stable home with someone who loved me to begging friends for temporary sleeping arrangements, all because I'd been honest about needing to explore my feelings. I'd thought I was being mature and authentic, but somehow I'd ended up homeless and dependent on people's charity. Marcus was dealing with his own stress about the housing situation. The hostel manager had given him a warning about the guest policy violations, and he was worried about losing his student housing if they decided to kick him out. He started spending more time at the library and coffee shops, partly to study, but partly to avoid the awkward tension at the hostel. I could feel the romantic momentum between Marcus and me getting crushed under the weight of practical problems. It's hard to maintain passion and connection when you're worried about where you're going to sleep each night and how you're going to afford basic living expenses. The intensity that had drawn us back together was being replaced by stress and logistical complications. Ryan wasn't responding to my texts or calls. I'd tried reaching out to explain that I never meant for things to get so complicated, that I just needed some space to figure out my feelings. I wanted to apologize for how everything had spiraled and see if we could work something out, maybe find a way to repair the damage I'd caused. But his silence was devastating. This was someone who'd shared 18 months of his life with me, someone who'd supported me through job stress and family problems and all the normal ups and downs of adult life. Now he was treating me like a stranger, like someone not worth responding to or acknowledging. After a week of couch surfing, I was exhausted and frustrated and starting to question every decision I'd made. The clarity I'd been seeking about my feelings for Marcus was getting muddied by the chaos of our living situation. It was impossible to focus on romance when we were both stressed about basic survival needs. Marcus started making comments about how complicated everything had become. He said he'd expected our reconnection to be fun and passionate, not a constant struggle with housing and money problems. He reminded me that he was still a student with limited resources, that he couldn't be responsible for solving my housing crisis. 2 weeks into my nomadic existence, the reality of what I'd lost was becoming impossible to ignore. I was carrying my entire life in 3 duffel bags, sleeping on different couches every few nights, and trying to maintain some semblance of professional stability while dealing with constant uncertainty about where I'd be staying next. Marcus and I barely had any time alone together anymore. When I was staying at friends' places, he couldn't come over because that would be imposing on their hospitality. When he was at the hostel, I couldn't stay because of the guest policies. We were reduced to meeting at coffee shops and parks, trying to recapture the connection that had felt so natural in Ryan's apartment. The stress was taking a toll on both of us. Marcus was falling behind in his classes because he was spending so much time helping me figure out housing solutions, I was having trouble concentrating at work because I was constantly worried about where I'd sleep each night and how long I could keep imposing on friends' generosity. During one particularly honest conversation at a coffee shop, Marcus admitted that he was starting to have doubts about whether we'd made the right choice. He said the chaos of the last 2 weeks had reminded him of why our relationship hadn't worked 3 years ago. We were both intense people who brought out drama and complications in each other's lives. I tried to argue that the current situation was temporary, that once we found stable housing, we could focus on rebuilding our connection. But Marcus pointed out that my housing crisis was just the latest in a series of dramatic situations that seemed to follow me wherever I went. He said maybe some people were just better at creating chaos than building stability. His words stung because there was truth in them. Looking back at my relationship history, I could see a pattern of dramatic decisions and complicated situations. With Ryan, I'd had the most stable and peaceful relationship of my adult life, and I'd blown it up because I was bored and curious about what else might be out there. The final blow came when Marcus told me he'd been accepted to a program at a university across the country. He said he'd applied months ago, but hadn't mentioned it because he wasn't sure he'd get in. Now he was planning to transfer at the end of the semester, which was only 6 weeks away. I felt like he'd been keeping this huge secret while I was upending my entire life to be with him. He said he hadn't thought it was relevant when we first reconnected, but now he was realizing it might actually be the perfect opportunity for both of us to start fresh somewhere else. But when I asked if he wanted me to come with him, Marcus hesitated in a way that told me everything I needed to know. He said, maybe we should both take some time to figure out what we really wanted before making any big decisions about the future. He suggested that maybe this separation could help us both grow as individuals. I realized he was breaking up with me. After I'd left Ryan and made myself homeless and burned bridges with friends who were tired of my drama, Marcus was deciding he didn't want to deal with the complications of being with me. He was using the same language I'd used with Ryan, about needing space and time to figure things out. The irony was devastating. I'd convinced myself that I needed to explore my feelings for Marcus to know if what Ryan and I had was real. Now I was discovering that what Marcus and I had wasn't strong enough to survive even basic life stress, while Ryan had been offering me the kind of stable love that most people spend their whole lives searching for. Marcus helped me carry my bags to another friend's apartment that night, and we had what felt like a goodbye conversation, even though we didn't call it that. He said he hoped I'd find happiness and stability, that I deserved to be with someone who could give me what I needed. But we both knew he wasn't going to be that person. I'd always thought of myself as someone who was honest and authentic, someone who faced difficult truths instead of living in denial. But I'd learned the difference between honesty and cruelty, between authenticity and selfishness. Real maturity meant considering how your actions would affect the people you claim to love, not just pursuing whatever felt exciting or emotionally satisfying in the moment. On quiet nights in my small apartment, I thought about Ryan and hoped he was building something beautiful with someone who appreciated what he had to offer. I hoped she was smart enough to recognize that stability wasn't boring, that daily kindness was more valuable than passionate chaos, that having someone who consistently chose to love you was the rarest gift of all. I'd learned too late that some opportunities, once lost, can never be recovered. Some trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired. Some people, once hurt that deeply, can never look at you the same way again. These were hard truths I was still learning to live with, alone in the small space that was now my world, built from the ashes of everything I'd destroyed in pursuit of something I'd thought I needed, but had never really wanted at all.